Have you ever been judged, publicly, unfairly, before even speaking a word? Imagine sitting in a luxury jet cabin, minding your own business, and suddenly being told, "You don't belong here." That's exactly what happened to Ava Carter, but what no one on that plane knew, especially not the woman accusing her, was that Ava was about to flip the entire narrative on its head. So, before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments. And if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on appearances, hit that subscribe button because this story, it's going to shake you. The sun gleamed against the polished curve of the private aircraft as it sat poised on the runway, ready for takeoff. Inside, the cabin was the very definition of elite. Leather seats stitched in gold thread, champagne already bubbling in crystal glasses, and a soundtrack of soft jazz humming beneath the chatter of its high-profile passengers. Charles and Evelyn Whitman, both in their 60s and seasoned travelers, were already settled into their usual seats. Charles unfolded his newspaper with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before, while Evelyn reached into her hand-woven travel bag and began to knit with dainty precision. Across the aisle, a socialite named Pamela Blake scrolled through photos of her last vacation, eyes darting between her phone and the other passengers with thinly veiled curiosity. At the entrance stood Victoria Hale, the head flight attendant, her appearance pristine. Sharp cheekbones, tailored uniform, blonde hair wound into a bun so tight it looked carved. She greeted each guest with a carefully calibrated smile. Warmth dialed up for the wealthy, cool, and clipped for those she deemed unimportant. Her sense of order didn't come from the rules of aviation, but from her own hierarchy of appearance, elegance, and perceived worth. And then, Ava Carter stepped on board. She was in her late 30s, tall and poised, with skin like smooth bronze and eyes that held an unsettling calm. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a high-neck silk blouse, paired with slacks that fit like they were made for her, because they were. Her hair was neatly pinned, and her steps were measured, not showy but confident. From the moment she entered, there was something about her that unsettled Victoria. She didn't smile too much. She didn't look around like someone impressed by luxury. She didn't overcompensate. In Victoria's mind, that meant Ava thought too highly of herself, and that was unacceptable. "Welcome aboard," Victoria said with a clipped tone, her eyes barely meeting Ava's. There was no warmth in her voice, no offer of help or drink like she had given the Whitmans. Ava merely nodded, taking the gesture in stride, and proceeded to her seat in the elite section near the front. As she reached down to slide her bag neatly under the seat in front of her, Victoria's gaze followed her like a hawk tracking prey. Moments passed, more passengers boarded, the cabin filled with casual conversation and the subtle rustle of newspapers, tablets, and champagne flutes. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling. Something about Ava rubbed her the wrong way. She wasn't normal for this space, not flashy enough to flaunt wealth, not submissive enough to feel grateful, and far too composed to be someone trying to impress. It didn't add up. Victoria moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering rehearsed smiles, but her eyes kept darting back to Ava. Finally, as if unable to hold back, she approached Ava's seat and leaned slightly over her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice honeyed with superiority. "I believe you're in the wrong section. This area is reserved for elite-tier passengers only." Ava looked up, her expression unreadable but polite. "This is my seat," she replied simply. Her tone was even, but her eyes held firm, like someone accustomed to being doubted, but not easily shaken. Victoria gave a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't believe that's correct. I'm quite sure this section—" "You might want to double-check the manifest before assuming anything," Ava interrupted gently. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't snap. She simply suggested it. That infuriated Victoria even more. How dare this woman, this nobody in her mind, speak with such confidence? "There's no need to check," Victoria said coldly. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." Around them, heads began to turn. Pamela Blake leaned slightly in her seat, lips parted, hoping for drama. Charles Whitman peered over his glasses with mild interest. The tension had begun to swell like static before a storm. Ava didn't budge. "Then I guess we'll see," she said quietly, her eyes not leaving Victoria's. Victoria crossed her arms. "If you don't move, I'll have to escalate this." Ava tilted her head, her voice soft but impenetrable. "Do what you have to do." And just like that, Victoria's control began to slip. The illusion of power she'd built so carefully in her mind, one shaped entirely by status, surface, and assumptions, was beginning to crack. But she didn't know yet how badly it would shatter, and she definitely didn't know who she was messing with. Victoria's heels clicked sharply on the carpeted aisle as she turned away from Ava, her face burning with a mix of indignation and disbelief. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Ava Carter, who didn't fit the mold of what Victoria believed belonged in that cabin. She approached Riley Monroe, the junior flight attendant, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease. "Escort her to the back," Victoria snapped under her breath, her voice low but firm. Riley hesitated. Her fingers gripped the passenger manifest, eyes flicking nervously from the list to Ava's calm figure in seat 1C. Maybe we should just verify her name," she murmured, voice barely audible, but Victoria's glare was sharp enough to slice through steel. "I said escort her," she barked. Riley swallowed hard and stepped forward. Ava, still seated with perfect posture, turned slightly toward her. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," Ava said, not as a threat but as a warning cloaked in serenity. Riley froze. Her instincts screamed that Ava was right, that something wasn't adding up, but her training told her to obey the chain of command. The cabin had quieted noticeably, conversations thinning into whispers, stolen glances exchanged like currency. Pamela Blake leaned into the aisle, whispering to Evelyn Whitman, "She's probably trying to sneak a free ride." Evelyn, ever the quiet one, said nothing, but Charles lowered his newspaper just enough to raise a brow. Victoria turned back to Ava, her voice rising an octave. "You're holding up the flight. You need to move to the back of the plane or I will call security." Ava met her gaze again, unflinching. "I've already told you. I'm not moving." Her tone was almost soothing, but it landed with the weight of finality. Victoria clenched her jaw, clearly rattled by Ava's unwavering composure. "You don't belong here," she hissed. Ava didn't blink. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people," she replied. Victoria scoffed, glancing at the passengers for validation. "This is what entitlement looks like," she said loud enough for the entire row to hear. "Some people think they're above the rules." The words echoed in the hushed cabin. Ava simply reached for her phone, typed something quickly, and placed it face down on the armrest beside her. The act was simple but deliberate, and it sent a flicker of anxiety through Victoria's chest. Still, she brushed it off. "I'm going to make this very clear," she said. "You have two options. Move, or I'll have you removed." Just then, Daniel Rhodes, the businessman in 2A, leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm. "Is there a problem?" Victoria turned on him. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage this disruption." "From where I'm sitting," Daniel said evenly, "you're the one causing a disruption." The murmurs began again, louder this time. Riley stood awkwardly near the front, shifting her weight from foot to foot, eyes flicking toward the manifest again, then back at Ava. Her fingers trembled as she reached out for the clipboard. "Riley," Victoria snapped, "what do you think you're doing?" "I was just checking. I have this under control." Victoria snapped again, silencing her. Riley recoiled, biting her lip, humiliated. Tension crawled like ivy up the walls of the cabin. Ava remained still, her back straight, her breathing steady, but her silence was louder than any protest could have been. It was a quiet defiance, the kind that made people question what they thought they knew, the kind that unnerved those who relied on power through intimidation. Victoria, growing increasingly desperate, performed her rounds, tray of water glasses in hand. She served the Whitmans with a glowing smile, then moved deliberately past Ava, ignoring her completely. Ava waited, patient but observant. Finally, she spoke. "Excuse me, may I have some water?" Victoria paused. Her voice was clipped. "I'll get to you when I can," she said coldly, and walked away. Pamela watched the whole exchange, her eyes lighting up with anticipation of more drama. Charles muttered under his breath, but didn't interfere. Ava leaned back into her seat, eyes closed for a moment. She was calculating, steady, refusing to give Victoria the reaction she wanted. Minutes passed. Then Victoria returned, eyes narrowed as she caught sight of Ava's leg slightly extended into the aisle. Instead of asking politely or stepping over it, she made a show of adjusting her stride, then deliberately clipped Ava's knee with her foot. The tray tipped. Water glasses tumbled. Liquid splashed across Ava's lap and onto the carpet. Gasps erupted. "Watch where you're putting your legs," Victoria exclaimed theatrically. "You've made a mess." Ava looked down at the water, then up at Victoria with the same calm she'd carried since boarding. "You walked into my leg," she said quietly. "I've asked for nothing more than to be treated with basic respect." "Respect?" Victoria snapped, stepping closer. "People like you don't deserve my respect." The words dropped like a bomb. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the cabin. Daniel Rhodes set down his tablet. Riley gasped audibly. Even Pamela Blake recoiled slightly. And then Victoria slapped her. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. Ava's head snapped slightly to the side, but she didn't react. Not with shock, not with pain, not even with anger. Instead, she slowly straightened, folded her hands in her lap, and said, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The entire cabin was frozen. Riley's hand covered her mouth. Daniel was halfway out of his seat. The silence was heavier than turbulence, and no one knew what would come next. But Ava did. And in that silence she sat, composed, dignified, while Victoria Hale, who had spent her career controlling people with icy smiles and measured tones, began to unravel before everyone's eyes. And the flight was only just beginning. The slap still echoed in the silence, vibrating in the tension-thick cabin like an aftershock no one knew how to process. Ava Carter remained seated, her hands resting gently on her lap, her face calm, unreadable, as if the sting of the blow had never landed. But something had shifted, visibly, tangibly, not just in her posture, but in the atmosphere itself. Victoria Hale, on the other hand, stood with her chest rising and falling, eyes wide with adrenaline and rage and, beneath that, growing unease. For the first time, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Riley Monroe stood frozen near the front galley, her knuckles white around the clipboard she hadn't dared open. The cabin full of elite passengers, once comfortably immersed in their own luxury, had now become silent witnesses to a confrontation no one had expected. Daniel Rhodes was the first to speak. "Did you just strike a passenger?" he asked, voice low but filled with alarm. Victoria turned, flustered, her cheeks flushed, but still clinging to her delusion of control. "She was being disruptive. I gave her multiple warnings." "That wasn't a warning," Daniel said coldly. "That was an assault." The word hung there. Assault, like a gavel struck in court. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again, grasping for words that wouldn't come. Ava, meanwhile, finally reached for her phone. With no rush, she tapped the screen, typed something briefly, and then set it down again, face up this time. Victoria's eyes followed the gesture, and a ripple of something close to fear flickered through her expression. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Ava didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to Riley and said softly, "Can you please alert the captain? Tell him Ava Carter would like to speak with him directly." Riley blinked, stunned, then nodded without thinking. She disappeared into the cockpit. Victoria scoffed, trying to laugh it off, her tone brittle. "What, are you calling your lawyer now? Going to threaten me with some lawsuit?" Ava finally looked up at her, and there was no warmth left in her eyes, only clarity, sharp and still. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Mitchell Ford emerged, his usual composed demeanor disrupted by the clear tension radiating through the cabin. His eyes scanned the passengers, then landed on Ava. "Miss Carter," he said immediately, walking straight toward her. "We just received a call from Central Management." Everyone turned. Pamela Blake sat upright, her hand frozen over her handbag. Daniel leaned forward slightly, sensing something was about to break. "We were informed," the captain continued, his voice loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, "that the owner of this aircraft and of the airline is on board." He turned to face Victoria. "And that person is Miss Ava Carter." The revelation hit the cabin like a shockwave. Audible gasps burst from multiple directions. Pamela clutched Evelyn Whitman's arm and whispered, "She owns the airline?" Evelyn looked over her glasses, mouth parted. Daniel simply leaned back, nodding slowly as if confirming what he had suspected all along. Victoria froze, lips parted in disbelief, color draining from her face. That can't be right," she stammered. "There must be some mistake. She never said anything." "She didn't have to," the captain said flatly. "And yet you struck her." As if on cue, the cabin door opened again. Two sharply dressed assistants, Marcus Lee and Natalie Dean, stepped aboard with quiet purpose, briefcases in hand, eyes scanning the scene. "Miss Carter," Marcus said warmly, "everything's prepared for your next briefing. Do you require any immediate assistance?" Natalie added with a courteous tone, "Security is standing by if you'd like to proceed with formal action." Victoria took a step back, her voice catching in her throat. I didn't know. I didn't realize who she was." Ava stood slowly, each movement precise, powerful. She adjusted her blazer, turned to face the stunned passengers, and finally spoke to the room. "My name is Ava Carter," she said clearly, her voice carrying without force. "I am the founder and CEO of Carter Air. This aircraft, and every member of staff on it, ultimately reports to me." A new silence swept over the cabin, one of realization, not tension. "And what you witnessed here today," Ava continued, her gaze turning directly to Victoria, "was not just poor service. It was prejudice, assumption, and a gross abuse of power, not just against me, but against the standard of dignity we promise every passenger." Victoria tried to speak, but Ava raised a single hand and silenced her. "You didn't treat me this way because I was a bad passenger. You treated me this way because you decided I didn't belong. And now, we all see what happens when bias goes unchecked." The captain turned to Ava. "Miss Carter, how would you like to proceed?" Ava turned to Victoria, her voice steady but final. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty. You are no longer employed with Carter Air." "No, please." Victoria's voice broke, her posture crumbling, but Ava wasn't finished. "And because you physically assaulted me in front of witnesses, I am filing an official report with local authorities. You'll be disembarked into police custody." As if summoned by her words, two uniformed officers appeared at the boarding stairs, stepping into view outside the cabin. Natalie nodded to the captain, who signaled the doors to be opened. "You can't do this," Victoria pleaded, her voice cracking now, eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Ava replied coldly. "But that doesn't excuse your actions." Victoria's hands trembled as the officers boarded the plane. "Ma'am," one of them said firmly, "you're under arrest for assault. Please come with us." The sight of her being escorted down the aisle, hands cuffed behind her back, stunned the passengers into complete silence. Ava stood motionless, composed, as Victoria Hale, once the symbol of authority, was reduced to a disgraced silhouette vanishing down the steps of the plane. As the cabin door closed again and the cabin crew stood in awkward silence, all eyes turned to Ava, not in judgment, but in awe. As the cabin door sealed shut behind the officers, a hush lingered like mist across the plush interior, as if the very air had shifted with Victoria Hale's removal. Ava Carter remained standing, her presence commanding but calm, the weight of what had just occurred settling into the bones of everyone watching. No one reached for champagne. No one resumed idle chatter. Pamela Blake clutched her handbag against her chest, blinking in quiet shock. Charles Whitman nodded solemnly to himself, folding his newspaper with care as if to signal respect. Riley Monroe, still near the front of the cabin, looked down at her shoes, visibly shaken but trying to steady her breath. Ava's gaze swept the cabin, not as a rebuke, but as acknowledgement. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, toward the center aisle, her voice smooth as polished glass. "To everyone here, I want to apologize," she began, and gasps rippled again, this time in disbelief. The CEO was apologizing? Ava continued, "No one should have to witness what you did today. That is not the standard of service I built this company to represent. What happened was unacceptable, but it will be addressed." She turned to Captain Mitchell Ford, who stood at respectful attention near the galley. "Captain," she said, "thank you for handling the situation with composure. I want a full incident report filed immediately, and I'd like recordings from all security feeds reviewed and preserved." "Understood, Miss Carter," he replied. His tone was professional, but there was a renewed gravity in it now, like a man realizing that the job he had done for years had just been placed under a new, unflinching lens. Ava turned next to Riley, who flinched slightly under her attention but didn't look away. "Miss Monroe," Ava said, her tone softening, "you did the right thing today, even when it wasn't easy." Riley's eyes widened. I should have spoken up sooner," she said quietly, shame creeping into her voice. Ava shook her head gently. "You listened to your conscience. That matters, and because of your integrity, I'll be recommending you for a promotion. You deserve it." Riley blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Ava offered a small nod, then turned back to the passengers. "I know many of you are here for important meetings, vacations, or simply a peaceful journey. I promise this flight will continue, and every one of you will be treated with the dignity you paid for and deserve." Daniel Rhodes, still in 2A, gave a slow, deliberate clap. It wasn't for show. One by one, others joined in. Not the explosive applause of a stadium, but something quieter, deeper, and more sincere. Even Evelyn Whitman set aside her knitting to place her hands together gently. Pamela Blake, whose eyes still shimmered with astonishment, said aloud, "Miss Carter, you're incredible." Ava gave her a brief but kind smile. "Thank you," she replied. Then, returning to her seat, she sank back into the leather with measured grace. Her assistants, Marcus Lee and Natalie Dean, hovered close but respectfully silent. Natalie leaned in. "The statement's draft is ready if you'd like to review it before landing." Ava nodded. "I'll review it in 20 minutes. First, let's just fly." The plane's engines began to hum louder as the aircraft prepared for takeoff again, but the real takeoff had already happened. Respect had been restored, not just to Ava, but to the spirit of what the airline was supposed to represent. As the jet ascended into the clouds, Ava took a breath and looked out the window, the sky stretching wide and endless beyond the glass. Her reflection flickered there faintly, calm, strong, and unbending. Below, the incident was already stirring the beginnings of something bigger. Security footage from inside the plane had automatically uploaded to Carter Air's compliance system. Legal was already reviewing it. News would break, social media would erupt, and Ava would not be hiding from any of it. In fact, she welcomed it. Because this wasn't just about one slap or one woman's prejudice. It was about what people allow when they assume silence is the same as weakness. Across from her, Daniel leaned across the aisle. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. "That was one of the most courageous things I've seen in a long time." Ava looked at him, a slight smile curving the corner of her mouth. "It wasn't courage," she said. "It was clarity." Meanwhile, Riley quietly informed the crew that Ava Carter would be remaining in the elite section, though no one dared question that anymore. Service resumed, but it felt different now. Sharper, more attentive. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Ava's water was brought promptly by a new attendant, who apologized profusely and with genuine warmth. Ava accepted it with grace. As she sipped, Natalie leaned in once more. "Press is requesting a statement. Do you want to handle it today, or wait until tomorrow?" Ava considered it for a moment. "Today," she said. "Let's not give anyone else the chance to tell the story wrong." Natalie nodded and moved swiftly to a nearby seat, already tapping away at her tablet. From the front to the back of the cabin, the passengers had fallen into an unusual quiet. Not awkward or tense, but reflective. Some, like Daniel, sat tall with renewed confidence. Others, like Pamela, clearly replayed the earlier events in their minds with new eyes. The world hadn't shifted in size, but something about it had changed in weight. As Ava gazed again out of the window, her thoughts weren't with the embarrassment, the sting, or even the victory. They were with every passenger who'd ever been quietly dismissed. Every worker like Riley, who'd been afraid to speak. Every stranger who'd been humiliated just because someone decided they didn't fit. And she knew, in that moment, that what happened on this flight couldn't stop at 30,000 feet. It had to go higher. Deeper. Wider. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about policy. About building something stronger in the wreckage of assumption. And Ava Carter would make sure that change didn't just land, it would fly. The plane cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet, its engines humming softly beneath the stillness of a cabin that no longer whispered with tension, but reverberated with quiet respect. Ava Carter sat by the window, a cup of chamomile tea gently steaming in her hands, her gaze fixed not on the sky but beyond it, beyond clouds, beyond headlines, beyond what had just happened. She wasn't thinking about the sting of the slap or the humiliation she had endured. She was thinking about what would come next. Across from her, Natalie Dean gave her a small nod, her tablet in hand. "The draft statement is ready," she said. "You can review when you're ready." Ava exhaled slowly, a breath of clarity more than relief, and reached for the tablet. The words were precise, intentional, but she made small changes, softening where needed, sharpening where it mattered most. Leadership wasn't about ego, it was about impact. 20 minutes later, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers dozed off or tucked into their meals. Riley Monroe stopped quietly by Ava's seat, offering a warm smile and a whisper of thanks, not just for the promotion, but for the way Ava had handled everything. "You reminded me why I got into this job," she said. Ava nodded, touched. "Then make sure you remind someone else when it's their turn." The rest of the flight passed like a cleansing breeze. By the time the plane touched down, media teams were already stationed near the tarmac. The footage had gone viral within hours. Multiple passengers had recorded parts of the altercation, and though Ava hadn't planned for this kind of attention, she wasn't hiding. When she stepped off the aircraft, flanked by Marcus and Natalie, she was calm, collected, and ready. Cameramen clicked. Reporters called her name. But Ava's eyes found the lens of one camera in particular, the one broadcasting live, and she spoke clearly. "We all deserve to be treated with dignity. No one should have to earn basic respect, and no one should lose it because of how they look." That clip was replayed across every major outlet that evening. Ava's calm, unwavering presence became the symbol of strength not through retaliation, but through resolve. Later that week, in a televised interview set inside a sleek, sunlit studio, the host leaned forward, clearly moved. "Miss Carter," she said, "millions have seen the footage. Millions more have applauded your restraint, your grace. What would you say to those who faced similar moments but don't have your platform?" Ava didn't hesitate. "You don't need to own an airline to take a stand," she said. "You just need to know your worth. Even when no one else in the room sees it yet, you have to hold it. Because power isn't about who's loudest. It's about who refuses to be diminished." The host nodded, clearly impacted. Ava continued, her tone steady. "This wasn't just about me. This was about the assumptions we make every day, And what happens when those assumptions are wrong? I want to make sure no one else has to endure that kind of silent indignity ever again." And she meant it. In the days that followed, Ava Carter launched a new initiative within Carter Air, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, paired with a training program designed not just for compliance, but for empathy. Flight crews across the country were enrolled. Customer service policies were rewritten. Every Carter Air plane carried a new card in every seatback pocket, a pledge of dignity signed by Ava herself. It read, "We don't just fly above the clouds, we rise above judgment. On this plane, you are valued." The campaign exploded across social media. Hashtags like "Fly with Respect" and @Ava's Pledge trended for days. Other airlines scrambled to review their own policies. Industry leaders reached out. Government regulators took notice. But Ava wasn't chasing applause. She was following principle. She turned the slap that once echoed in silence into a policy that would reverberate for generations. A few weeks later, Ava boarded another flight. Not her own this time, but one of the new domestic routes her team had recently approved. As she stepped on board, she was greeted by a new lead flight attendant, who offered a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter. We're honored to have you." Ava smiled back and nodded. It wasn't the greeting that moved her, it was the tone. It was the lack of pretense, the absence of judgment, the way the attendant looked her in the eyes without trying to assess her status. She took her seat quietly. The aircraft lifted off into the dusk. Through the window, city lights shimmered like scattered stars. And Ava felt it. A quiet triumph that wasn't about revenge, but redemption. Not a victory over one woman, but a victory for every unseen traveler who had ever felt small in a space they had every right to occupy. As the plane climbed into the night sky, Ava looked down at the earth slowly fading beneath the clouds. She wasn't above the world. She was part of it. But this time, she had given it a new shape, a better one. In the final scene of her statement video, released globally and watched by millions, Ava stood in front of a backdrop of planes taxiing on a sunlit runway. Her voice was calm but unshakable. "Luxury isn't about leather seats or champagne," she said. "It's about the experience we create. True success isn't measured by wealth. It's measured by how we treat people when no one's watching. That's the altitude I want to fly at, every time." She paused, then smiled. Not just for the camera, but for herself, because she knew now that even in the sky, the real change begins on the ground. Have you ever felt judged just by how you looked or where you were sitting? Tell us your story in the comments. We read every single one. And if this made you pause, think, or even smile a little, hit that subscribe button. More stories like this are on the way.